They said no one could escape Alcatraz. For nearly 30 years, no one did. Then, in 1962, 4 men tried. 3 slipped into darkness, into fog, into the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay. By morning, they were gone. No bodies, no wreckage, no proof, only silence. But one never reached the shore. While the others vanished, a single figure remained inside those concrete walls. The plan had been built together, the digging done in secret, the timing calculated. Then the wall refused to break. Minutes disappeared. The window closed. Dawn rose over Alcatraz. 3 were missing. 1 was still there, alive, left with questions that would echo for decades. More than 60 years later, the mystery remains. Did the trio make it? Or did the bay decide everything? And what does it do to someone to be the only one left behind? Alcatraz was built to stop men like him. A federal maximum security prison in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Cold water on every side, strong currents, no bridges, no easy way out. From 1934 to 1963, it held some of the most difficult inmates in the country. Men who had already caused trouble in other prisons. Men who had tried to escape before. The island was meant to break that idea, break the thought of trying. The water stayed near 50 degrees all year. The tides shifted without warning. Guards believed no one could survive the swim. And for nearly 30 years, no one officially did. Until June of 1962, 4 men began working in silence, digging through concrete, studying guard patterns, timing every movement. Alan West was one of them. He wasn't the leader, he wasn't the strongest, but he was part of the plan. And on the night everything changed, he was the only one still inside. They called it the Rock, the name that fits, hard, cold, unmoving. Alcatraz Island sat in the middle of San Francisco Bay, water all around it, strong wind, cold air. Some days, thick fog covered everything. You couldn't even see the mainland. Waves slammed into the rocks below. The sound moved through the prison halls. It never really stopped. For the men locked inside, men like Alan West, that water was not a view, it was a wall. Alcatraz opened in 1934. It was a federal maximum security prison built from concrete and steel, made to hold the worst inmates in the country. This was not for small crimes, not for petty thieves. This was for armed robbers, gang leaders, men who caused trouble in other prisons. Al Capone did time here, George Machine Gun Kelly too, and Robert Stroud, the man people called the Birdman of Alcatraz. From 1934 to 1963, more than 1,500 inmates passed through Alcatraz. Each man got a number, a uniform, and a strict routine. Alan West had one too, a number, a cell, a narrow window facing cold water. No inmate was ever officially recorded as escaping. That was the record.
Nobody escapes Alcatraz. You see that water out there? It stays around 50 degrees year-round, cold enough to shut your body down before you make it halfway. And the currents in the bay, they're not gentle. They'll pull you sideways, drag you under, spin you around until you don't know which way is shore. Doesn't matter how strong you think you are. Doesn't matter if you were the best swimmer back home. Out there, the water decides. That's why nobody escapes Alcatraz.
The water around the island was part of the prison. Cold, fast, unforgiving. The tides near the Golden Gate could pull a man away in minutes. The cold could shut his body down fast. That's what the guards believed. That's what Alan West was told. Inside the prison, life followed rules, strict rules. Men woke up before sunrise, ate breakfast, went to work, came back to their cells. Alan West followed that same routine. Talking was limited. Movement was watched. Steel doors slammed shut. Boots echoed on the metal floors. Everything was controlled. Every step, every action. Break a rule, lose your privileges. Break more rules, end up in D block. Solitary confinement. Dark, quiet, alone. But even in a place like that, something stayed alive. Hope. Even in men like Alan West. Every man in there once had a normal life. A home, people he knew, streets he walked. At night, when the prison got quiet, those memories came back. For the men inside Alcatraz, freedom wasn't something ahead of them, it was something behind them. From the yard, they could see San Francisco, the city lights, cars moving, life going on. On clear nights, they could even hear music from across the water, close enough to see it, close enough to hear it, but never close enough to touch it. That was the real punishment. Alcatraz didn't just lock men up, it reminded them what they were missing. For nearly 30 years, Alcatraz stood as a symbol of control, a prison built to stop escape, a place meant to break the idea of trying. But even there, some men started watching the tides, watching the guards, studying the walls. Alan West was one of them. Maybe the water wasn't impossible. Maybe the guards were wrong. And in 1962, 4 men decided to find out. Their plan would take months, and what happened next would become one of the most talked about prison escape stories in American history. Every prison has its stories, but the one that unfolded inside Alcatraz in 1962 began with 4 men who, on paper, had little in common, yet shared the same restless thought. There had to be more than this. The leader among them was Frank Morris. Quiet, serious, unusually intelligent. Records show his IQ tested above 133, far higher than most inmates the Bureau of Prisons had seen. He wasn't loud or violent. He observed. He studied. Born in Washington, D.C. in 1926, Morris grew up in foster homes and learned early to depend on himself. By his late teens, he drifted into theft and burglary. He thought fast, moved fast, and when he could, he disappeared. Over the years, he escaped from several prisons, including Louisiana State Penitentiary, one of the toughest in the South. Each time, he was caught. But his reputation stuck. A man who could spot weakness in concrete and steel. When he arrived at Alcatraz in 1960, he carried no visitors, no support, no illusions, only quiet resolve. Then there were the Anglin brothers, John and Clarence. They grew up in Rusk, Georgia, before their family moved north to Lake Michigan, Florida, and later to Donaldsonville, Georgia, following farm work from season to season. They were loyal, protective, the kind of brothers who moved as one. Their childhood wasn't easy, but it was steady. They learned to swim in cold, deep water. Even in early spring, the water could numb your skin. To them, it was normal. Those cold swims would later mean more than anyone realized. As they grew older, they turned to robbery. Careful, timed, controlled. Fake guns, quick entries, faster exits. Eventually, the law caught up. After a failed escape attempt in Alabama, both brothers were sent to prison. Like Morris, they caused little trouble. They worked, stayed polite, followed routine, all while watching, waiting, thinking. At Alcatraz, John Anglin became known as the quiet fixer. He could repair pipes, wiring, small machinery. Clarence, the younger brother, had a softer edge. Other inmates remembered him as calm, respectful. He missed his family deeply, especially their mother. Her letters mattered. The fourth man was Alan West, younger, restless, always moving. Born in New York in 1929, West joined the Army as a teenager, but trouble followed. His crimes were mostly car theft, impulsive, not violent, but the sentences stacked up. He landed at Alcatraz after attempting escape from a Florida prison. Inside, West worked maintenance, walls, vents, repairs. He saw parts of the prison others didn't. That would matter. Unlike Morris or the Anglins, West carried caution. He thought ahead, but he worried too. He wanted freedom, but he wanted to survive it. 4 men from different states, different pasts, pulled together by confinement. They didn't form a team overnight. Alcatraz forced men to measure each other slowly. Trust wasn't given, it was tested. They spoke during work shifts, in the tailor shop, in the yard. Small exchanges at first, then ideas. Over time, something formed. Not loud, not dramatic, just understanding. They were tired of gray mornings, tired of routine, tired of watching city lights across the bay. Each of them knew the odds. Each of them had heard it again and again. No one escapes from Alcatraz. But desperate men don't always accept what they're told. As the months passed, small details gained meaning. A vent cover, a hidden gap, the rhythm of nightly counts. They began seeing chances where others saw stone. And beneath the calm surface of life on the rock, something was forming. Slow, careful, dangerous. 4 men shaped by their past. 4 lives leaning toward one impossible idea. The plan had not begun, but the thought had. And once that thought took hold, there was no turning back. By the spring of 1961, the plan had begun to take shape. It didn't appear overnight. It grew slowly, built from routine, patience, and quiet risk. Frank Morris was the mind behind it, but it wasn't his plan alone. It became their plan, shared between 4 men who had little else left to share. Their cells were close together, a small detail most would ignore. Morris in 138, West nearby, the Anglin brothers a few doors down. They spoke through the air vents behind the concrete walls. At first, small talk, then timing, then steps. Each night, while others slept, they whispered through metal grates about a way out, not in dreams, but in stages. It started with the vents. Each cell had a small air opening low on the back wall, about 6 inches wide, covered by metal grating. Behind it was an unused utility corridor, dark, dusty, connected to a pipe chase that led upward. If they could reach it, they could move inside the walls. They began digging, slowly, carefully. Their tools were ordinary objects turned dangerous. Stolen spoons, scrap metal, a vacuum motor part sharpened against concrete. They worked during music hour. Radios played. Sound filled the tiers. The rhythm masked the scrape of metal on cement. Night after night, they widened the vent openings, inches at a time. They covered the growing holes with cardboard painted to match the wall. Simple covers, good enough in low light. The work took months. The concrete was old, brittle in places, thick in others. Each inch gained was a gamble. Dust filled the air behind the walls. They wrapped cloth over their mouths to breathe. Broken chunks of concrete were carried in pockets, scattered in the yard during work detail. Slow disappearance. Behind the cells, in the hidden corridor, they built a small workshop, just enough space to crouch. That space became the center of everything. There they shaped tools. There they prepared the raft. There they made the faces. They gathered more than 50 prison raincoats, some stolen, some traded quietly. Using glue made from melted floor wax, they stitched the coats together, pressed seams with hot steam pipes, formed a crude raft, and life vests. Not perfect, but enough to buoyant. Frank Morris worked on the dummy heads, soap, toilet paper, concrete dust, molded by hand, painted with flesh tones from the prison art room, hair swept from the barbershop floor. In dim light, they looked real. Real enough to rest on pillows during bed checks. Real enough to buy time. Every scrape risked exposure. Every quiet night felt like borrowed time. They used short signals through the vents. One word meant stop, another meant clear. Trust moved through metal and darkness. By day, they returned to routine. Sweep floors, wash trays, stand in line. Nothing in their movements showed what was growing behind the walls. But something had changed. Purpose. Morris studied guard patterns, footsteps, flashlight angles, pause lengths during counts. He memorized the rhythm of the prison. The Anglins focused on the raft, checking seams, sealing weak spots. Years of making do had taught them patience. Alan West handled materials, glue, paint, small tools. He measured openings, checked vent edges daily, made sure nothing looked disturbed. Their lives split in two, day under rules, night under walls. Days felt slow, nights moved fast. They carved paddles from scrap wood, stored the folded raft in the utility space, built a small air pump from a motor taken out of an accordion, improvised. By the summer of 1962, they were close. The vent holes were wide enough. The raft was sealed. The dummy heads waited in the corners of their cells. Still, patient. All they needed was the right night, correct tides, light wind, relaxed watch. It had taken more than a year of scraping stone, a year of hiding dust, a year of pretending nothing was happening, a year of living between reality and possibility. As summer approached, every sound in the prison felt sharper. A key turning, boots on metal, a distant crash of waves. The rock had not broken them, but soon it would test them. June 11th, 1962. A Monday night, calm and gray. Across San Francisco Bay, city lights shimmered through the fog. Inside Alcatraz, another long day was ending. 9:30 p.m., lights out. The last footsteps of the guards faded down the corridor. Cell doors clanged shut. The overhead lights dimmed. The tears settled into stillness. To anyone listening, it was just another night on the rock. Routine, predictable, unchanged. But for 4 men, this was the night everything had led to. Months of digging, shaping, waiting. There would be no second chance. 10 o'clock, the signal. A faint sound. Maybe a cough. Maybe a tap. It traveled through the air vents between the cells. the signal they had rehearsed in silence for months. Frank Morris moved first. He lifted the vent cover at the back of his cell, now wide enough for his shoulders. Behind it waited a narrow tunnel, dark, tight, lined with rough concrete. He slid through, inch by inch, until he reached the hidden corridor behind the cell block. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old stone. Moments later, John Anglin followed, then Clarence, carrying a small bundle stitched from torn bedsheets. Inside were paddles, homemade life vests, and part of the folded raft. They spoke in whispers. Every sound mattered. Above them, guards paced. Keys jingled. Wind pressed against barred windows. In cell 140, Alan West was still working. The vent he had widened for months had jammed again. Cement dust had hardened around the edges. He pushed at it with homemade tools, a spoon handle, a piece of wire. Nothing. He tried again and again. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. From behind the wall, faint movement. The others getting ready to climb. He knew the route by heart. Through the corridor, up the pipes, across the roof, down the far side, into the freezing water. But he couldn't reach them. The cement crumbled under his fingers. He scraped until his hands were raw. He leaned into the hole and called softly. No answer. By the time the vent finally broke free, it was nearly midnight. He looked through the opening. The corridor behind was empty. On the other side of the wall, silence. He was too late. He waited, listening. Nothing. The hum of lights. Wind through cracks. The faint ring of metal on metal. He understood. They were gone. Behind that wall, 3 men were climbing up the pipes. Slow, careful. The roof slick with fog and cold mist. They crossed to the northeast corner, slid down a vent pipe, dropped to the ground below. They moved across the yard. No one noticed. The fog was their shield. At the water's edge, they unfolded the raft, stitched from 50 raincoats, sealed with glue and determination. They inflated it with a small accordion-like device. The sound barely rose above the wind. When the raft took shape, they pushed it toward the shore. Around 11:30 p.m., Morris and the Anglin brothers stepped into the freezing water. The tide pulled toward the Golden Gate. City lights blinked faintly through the mist. They paddled into the darkness, their figures fading. No one ever saw them again. Back in his cell, Alan West sat on his bunk, staring at the hole in the wall, the same hole he had carved with his own hands. He waited for morning, unsure whether to call for help or pretend he didn't know what was happening. Alan West would later tell the story, how he had almost made it, how he had planned every step, how a few inches of hardened cement had changed everything. For him, the escape ended in that cell, not with the raft, not with the swim, but with the sound of nothing at all. That night, 3 men vanished into the dark. By morning, Alcatraz was no longer just a prison. It was a crime scene, and the hunt was about to begin. By dawn, the cells were empty. Inside the prison, confusion spread quickly. But outside the walls, a larger question was already forming. If they made it off Alcatraz, could they have survived the water? The distance from the island to the Marin headlands is roughly 1.25 miles. But distance was never the real obstacle. That night, The temperature of the San Francisco Bay was estimated between 50 and 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Water that cold drains body heat fast. Muscle strength weakens. Breathing becomes harder to control. Exhaustion can begin within minutes. Prison officials were quick to conclude that no one could survive those conditions for long. But the currents complicate that conclusion. Tidal patterns in the bay are not fixed. At certain hours, outgoing currents move toward the Golden Gate, not out to open sea. If the men entered the water at the right moment, the current may have carried them toward shore. Years later, independent hydrodynamic studies suggested that a midnight departure could have improved their chances of survival. The FBI maintained that the escape likely ended in the water. No bodies were ever recovered. But the absence of bodies did not close the case. Days later, fragments of raincoat material were found floating in the bay. Investigators believed it came from the makeshift raft. A wooden paddle, assembled from scrap, was also recovered. None of it proved survival. None of it confirmed death. Relatives of the Anglin brothers later claimed to have received unsigned postcards. Decades later, a photograph surfaced in Brazil. It allegedly showed the two brothers standing together. The image was never conclusively authenticated. In 2013, a letter appeared. The writer claimed to be John Anglin. He stated that all three men survived that night. Handwriting analysis was inconclusive. The letter offered no verifiable proof. Today, the U.S. Marshals Service continues to list the case as open. What happened in the water remains the central uncertainty. If they drowned, the bay kept its silence. If they survived, they disappeared with equal precision. Either way, the crossing, not the cell, was the final test. And it is the only part of the escape no one witnessed. Allen West sat alone in his cell, staring at the small hole he had carved with his own hands. The others were gone. The plan he helped build had moved forward without him. Hours earlier, he'd worked in rising urgency, trying to widen the vent that had jammed with hardened cement dust. His hands were raw, bleeding. He dug at the edges with a spoon and a piece of metal, forcing the weakened concrete to give way. He later recalled hearing faint sounds in the distance, movement above, the others slipping through the utility corridor. And then, silence. By the time the vent finally broke free, the stillness inside the cell house had settled. He climbed toward the opening, but by then, the tide outside had already begun to shift. Whether he was minutes behind or only seconds remains impossible to confirm. There were no clocks marking the exact moment his delay became permanent. He stayed where he was, suspended between action and aftermath, part of the plan, but no longer part of the escape. In later interviews, Allen West often appeared composed. He told investigators he did not know what happened to the others. At times, he suggested they likely drowned. Consistency, however, does not eliminate uncertainty. Memory under stress is rarely precise, and on a night measured in minutes, even small distortions can shift the sequence of events. Some officials quietly questioned whether urgency or frustration may have influenced how West later recalled the timing. Not to suggest deception, but to acknowledge how fragile recollection can become when tied to regret. Those who spoke with him over the years described a man who carried the weight of that night. He had survived, but survival did not equal closure. Each remaining day inside Alcatraz unfolded under the knowledge that he had come closer than anyone else and stopped short. When the prison closed in 1963, less than a year after the escape, West was transferred. He was eventually released. He lived quietly in Florida. Before his death in 1978, he repeated his account once more to federal authorities. He said he had missed his chance. He never claimed to have seen the others again. His story remained unchanged. And yet, it remains the only detailed account of what occurred inside the cell house in those final minutes. Allen West lived, but whether he was left behind by circumstance or by seconds that cannot be measured is a question that will never be fully resolved. 4 men planned to break free. 3 vanished into the night. 1 was left behind to live with the story and the silence that followed him for the rest of his life. Maybe they made it. Maybe the bay claimed them before sunrise. No one knows. But for one night in June 1962, they did the impossible. They turned prison scraps into hope. They turned walls into opportunity. And they proved that even a place like Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary was not beyond challenge. More than 60 years later, the question still drifts across the cold waters of San Francisco Bay. Did they survive, or did the current decide their fate? That uncertainty is what keeps this story alive. Not the answers, but the mystery. If stories like this remind you how much history still hides in the dark, subscribe, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and stay with us as we return to the cases that never truly found closure.